Shabbat Shalom, family. This is a Shabbat lesson that we had from a conversation that we had on the conference call line on September 12, 2015. Unfortunately, we didn't record the phone conversation that we had on the conference call that day, and I really wish we had, because we had such a great time that day with our brothers and sisters reasoning together, and everyone was, in agreement, and it just everything flowed so smoothly. I wish we had recorded the call, but nevertheless, what we ended up doing was writing out a note of the conversation covering all the precepts that we went over, and now I'm going to go ahead and read that with you guys here on the video. Read along with me, and hopefully you too can get edification from the session that we had on this Shabbat lesson. When looking out amongst Israel, we see the Old Testament Israelites in confusion and the New Testament Israelites in confusion. We see some not rocking with Paul, but we also see very few who understand why all the confusion persists. And as a reminder, confusion, family, is of the devil. The Old Testament Israelites make some valid points, but they still don't understand. This is the first note in a series where we hope to reveal the reason for the confusion and then offer the solution as well. Now, a little bit about us. We believe that Hamashiach is the Son of Yah. He's sinless, and he defeated death. He's sitting at the right-hand side of Yah, and he was sent to lead us back to Yah. We also believe Paul is a liar and not an apostle of Hamashiach. We believe the New Testament has been highly tampered with. Now, to begin, we should all know that the Most High does not condone human sacrifice. There's nowhere in the Old Testament, in the laws, or in the prophets that it is stated that we will be saved by anyone other than Yah. And furthermore, we also should be aware that we cannot be saved by the blood of another person. We will all face judgment for our own sins. And proof of that, or confirmation of that, is Hamashiach telling us to keep the commandments. Now, if we were saved by Hamashiach's blood, he wouldn't be telling us to keep the commandments to be saved. In addition, when we get to the New Testament, we see that Yahushua Hamashiach never claimed to be Yah. He said things such as, "There's no one good but our Father in heaven." And when teaching us how to pray, he said to say this, "Our Father who art in heaven," and so on and so forth. And also when ending the prayer, he never instructed us to pray in his name, in the name of Yahushua Hamashiach. Now, when we reflect on Hamashiach being our high priest and king, we must look back in the Old Testament to see if we can see examples of the Israelites being instructed to pray in the name of Aaron or his sons, who were the high priests, Levites from the family of Aaron, or to pray in the name of our kings, such as Saul, David, or King Solomon, to name a few. Nowhere will you ever see that being done. So we just need to keep these little facts in mind. When we start to go into the New Testament, we have to be careful because, first of all, we know that the Council of Nicaea put together the books that will be included in the New Testament. So that means that they were able to pick and choose which books to include. So just by that fact alone, we know that they had access to censor, to add, or to take away from out the New Testament scriptures, out of the instructions given to us by Hamashiach and his apostles. And we want to be careful that we don't end up inadvertently worshiping another quote-unquote God or an idol, or just in general worshiping Yah in the wrong way. We want to just be careful, we just need to be careful. So the best place to start would be with Paul, because Paul's grace doctrine is what all of Christianity follows. But Hamashiach tells us to keep the commandments. And just to make things clear, when we talk about Christianity, we're talking about organized religion, because we ourselves are followers of Hamashiach. So, you know, we're not coming against people who follow Hamashiach. We're saying organized religion, which is called quote-unquote Christianity. This is what we're pointing out, that there's a problem with the doctrine of Christianity. And so we want to be careful that we don't end up going the wrong way. We also know that we are Israelites. We're waking up and we're finding out our heritage. We're finding out who we are, getting our identity back. And so we claim to be Hebrew Israelites. We also are aware that there are many Hebrew Christians amongst us still. And, you know, you can't really be mad about that. That's just kind of like the flow of things. Because if you're just waking up, all you know is Christianity and the doctrine you were taught in Christianity. So some of the things that you speak or some of the things that you believe will still have their roots in that doctrine that you were raised up in, which is indoctrination. So, but there's going to be a point during your transition that you still sound like a Christian, even though you're claiming to be an Israelite. So we just want to point out that we know, or we see, that Christianity has holes in its doctrine, and we also see that many Hebrews are still holding on to some of that Christian doctrine. And these things need to be corrected. We need to come in agreement on the New Testament and on what all we learned and picked up from Christianity, so that we can get all the leaven, if you will, out of our doctrine. Because as we said, Hamashiach tells us to keep the commandments. Paul's doctrine, his grace doctrine, is a little different, or greatly different, from what Hamashiach taught us. And we'll get into that. But first, a word from Hamashiach. In Revelations chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, we have a letter written to the church of Ephesus. And this is amongst the 7 letters to the churches that Hamashiach addresses in Revelations chapter 1, 2, and chapter 3 as well. In Revelations 2, verse 1, it says, "Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, These things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know thy works, and thy labor, and thy patience, and how thou cannot bear them which are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles, and are not, and hast found them liars." Now here we have Hamashiach commending the people in the church of Ephesus for having enough discernment to see that there was someone or multiple people there calling himself or themselves an apostle, but are not. Hamashiach calls these fakes liars. Now we have a letter in the New Testament written to the church of Ephesus, the people living in Ephesus, by a man named Paul. That's in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Yahushua Hamashiach, by the will of Yah, to the saints which are at Ephesus, and to the faithful in Yahushua Hamashiach. So that's pretty interesting that here we have a warning from Hamashiach to the people in Ephesus, warning against someone calling themselves an apostle who is a liar and is not an apostle. And here we have a letter written to the Ephesians by Paul, who is saying he's an apostle. That's the first thing he says in this letter. Let's continue and get a little bit more understanding on this matter. Now we're going to go to Revelations chapter 21, where we get a description of the New Jerusalem. Verse 12, "And had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel." In Revelations 21 verse 14, it says, "And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb," the Lamb being Yahushua Hamashiach. Now here we have a description of the New Jerusalem, and we're told that the wall of the city has 12 foundations with the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The apostles aren't named in this verse, but if we go precept upon precept, we can gain understanding. Now in Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 13, we have a list of the 12 apostles there. Now we can get a list in multiple places in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We're going to start with Acts chapter 1, or we'll just use this example. And in Acts chapter 1, this is after Hamashiach died, where the 12 apostles, or as we'll read on, we'll see it's the 11 apostles, they were gathered together after Hamashiach died. And it says, verse 13, "And when they were come in, they went up into an upper room where abode both Peter." So as we read this, let's count out the number of the people assembled here. There was Peter, that's number 1, and James, 2, and John, 3, and Andrew, 4, Philip, 5, and Thomas, 6, Bartholomew, 7, and Matthew, 8, James the son of Alphaeus, 9, and Simon Zealots, 10, and Judas the brother of James, 11. Now the number of apostles mentioned is 11. One is missing, and as we continue to read down in the book of Acts chapter 1 from verses 13 down to 20, we see that the reason they are assembled is to choose a new apostle, because the missing 12th apostle, Judas Iscariot, had killed himself after betraying Yahushua HaMashiach for 30 pieces of silver. Before they choose the new replacement apostle, Peter tells us the requirements of being an apostle. And you'll find that in Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 26. And just to give you a little recap, before you get to that verse in Acts chapter 1, the apostles are gathered in an upper room, and they're discussing how Judas betrayed Yahushua HaMashiach. And then Peter went on to get to business to discuss how they would go about choosing a new apostle to replace Judas Iscariot. And in the midst of his in the midst of him speaking to everyone in the room, he starts out in verse 21 saying, "Wherefore of these men which have companied with us all the time that Yahushua HaMashiach went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until that same day that he was taken up from us, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. And they appointed two, Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was surnamed Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, Thou, Yah, which knowest the hearts of all men, show whether of these two thou hast chosen, that he may take part of this ministry and apostleship from which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go to his own place. And they gave forth their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. So what we see here is that to be one of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, an apostle of Yahushua HaMashiach, one would have had to be a witness with the others of Hamashiach's baptism by John the Baptist, and walked with him during his ministry until the day he ascended up to heaven to sit at the right-hand side of the Father. We see there that there was two that could possibly be the 12th apostle to take the place of Judas, and the apostles did what we often see done in the Old Testament. They cast lots so that Yah could decide who would be the 12th apostle himself. The lot fell on Matthias, who in turn became the 12th apostle after Judas, and was numbered with the other 11 apostles that we read about in Acts chapter 1, verse 13. Now this is important to note, because most of the things that Paul says in his several letters in the New Testament are problematic. We also can see that the 7 churches in Revelation that Hamashiach addressed are different from the places that Paul sent his letters to, with the exception of Ephesus, which we've discussed already. So you can look here at the picture that we've provided here. We know that the book of Revelations is addressed to the 7 churches which are in Asia. That's in Revelations 1 verse 4. Here you can see all the different locations of the churches that were addressed in Revelation. And all those churches are here in Turkey also. We see that. Now, if you were to look at a map showing all the letters or churches that Paul addressed, you'll have a different set of churches from the ones we just noted that were addressed in Revelations chapter 1, 2, and 3. Now let's discuss some of the things that Paul said and juxtapose those up against the things that Hamashiach said in the New Testament. And we'll start with the law. Now Hamashiach tells us in Matthew chapter 5 verse 17, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." So here we have Hamashiach letting us know until heaven and earth pass away, the law still stands. And not one jot or one tittle will pass away from the law until all be fulfilled. Now, Paul says in Romans chapter 6 verse 14, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace." He also tells us in Galatians 5 verse 18, "But if ye be led of the Spirit, ye are not under the law." And my question is, what spirit is he talking about? Hamashiach said that the Spirit would come, but he never said that just because it was coming, we were not under the law. Hamashiach tells us in John chapter 16 verse 7 and 8, "Nevertheless, I tell you the truth. It is expedient for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Comforter will not come unto you. But if I depart, I will send him unto you. And when he is come, he will reprove the world of sin, and of righteousness, and of judgment." And we know sin is the transgression of the law, as written in 1 John 3 verse 4 and 5. "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. For sin is the transgression of the law." So we have here Hamashiach saying that the Comforter will come and reprove the world of sin, or reprove the world of transgression of the law. And he also tells us in John chapter 16 verse 13, "Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth. For he shall not speak of himself, but whosoever he shall hear, that shall he speak. But whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak. And he will show you things to come." So this is confirmation that in John 16:7, he said the Comforter will come and reprove the world of sin. And in John 16 verse 13, he says, "Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come." So this Spirit of truth is the Comforter, and the Spirit of truth will reprove the world of sin or breaking of the law. So I don't know what spirit Paul was speaking of, because Hamashiach said that the spirit he was going to send would reprove the world of sin or law breaking. Now another thing that Paul says is, you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't work, you don't eat. Now let's go to the Old Testament to verify some facts, starting with King David in 1 Samuel chapter 30 verse 9. And it reads, So David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those that were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and the 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. And they found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and gave him bread, and he did eat, and they made him drink water. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs, and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread, nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 21. And David came to the 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow David, whom they had made also to abide at the brook Besor. And they went forth to meet David, and to meet the people that were with him. And when David came near to the people, he saluted them. Then answered all the wicked men and men of Belial, of those that went with David, and said, because they went not with us, speaking of the 200 men that stayed behind, we will not give them aught of the spoil that we have recovered, save to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Then said David, ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which Yah hath given us, who hath preserved us, and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. For who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. And it was so, from that day forward, that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day. Now, did you notice that in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 22, the 400 men were mad, and they said that because the 200 men did not put in the work as far as being in the battle, fighting, they felt like the 200 should not get any part of the spoils, should not get to eat. And notice that those men that didn't want the 200 to get paid were called wicked men and men of Belial by Yahuwah. Now let's see what the 12 apostles did. In Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, it reads, And in those days, when the number of the disciples were multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them, and said, It is not reason that we should leave the word of Yah and serve tables. This is after Hamashiach rose and ascended up to heaven to sit at the Father's right hand side. This is in Acts chapter 6. After Hamashiach rose and ascended to the Father's side in heaven, and here we have the apostles, the 12 apostles, making a decision to not work, because they said if it's not reason that we should leave the word of Yah and serve tables. They go on in verse 3 saying, Wherefore, brethren, look ye out among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Ruach and wisdom, who we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And the sayings pleased the whole multitude. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Ruach, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, or Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. So here we see that the 12 apostles believed that they needed to spend all their time in the service of Yah, praying and spreading the true gospel learned from Yahushua HaMashiach. And really, that's understandable, because if not them, they who were with Hamashiach all the time, publicly and in private, then who? But you see, we have a problem here in doctrine, because Paul says if you don't work, you don't eat. But we have the real apostles chosen by Hamashiach while he was walking here on earth, make a decision to not work, but to work, to daily pray to Yah and engage themselves in the ministry and spreading the word of Yah. Now, we also know by the law of tithing that Israel had a type of welfare system, if you will. The way the laws are set up is like a socialism type system in that regard. So again, the question is, we're dealing with Paul's doctrine of you don't work, you don't eat. And now we want to go to the law and see if we have something like that in our law, saying if you don't work, you don't eat. And we must say we cannot find that in the law. What we see in the law is people being provided for from all stations of life. You know, people being provided for in our law, which is a type of socialist type system. So therefore, if you don't work, you still eat. But we'll see what the law says. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 28 through 29 says, and this is regarding the tithing, this is part of the law of tithes. It says, at the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thy increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that Yah may bless thee in all thy work, in all the work of thine hand which thou dost. You see that? And the Levite, so you take up the tithes at the end of every 3 years. You take the tithes, lay it up, and what happens with these tithes? The Levites, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, all these which are within the gate shall come and shall eat. But Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat, or you can't eat. As we see here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, he writes to us, for even when we were with you, we used to give you this order. If anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. Now, if King David said that this was a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day, and if nowhere in the law does it say people who don't work can't eat, and if the 12 apostles, the real apostles, made a decision to not work, then why is Paul saying the total opposite? Let's check out another situation, because it seems like Paul took some pot shots at the real apostles. Now the Messiah tells us in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5, these 12 Hamashiach sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves, for the workman is worthy of his meat. It also says in Mark chapter 6, verse 7 through 10, and he called unto him the 12, and began to send them forth by 2 and 2, and gave them power over unclean spirits, and commanded them that they should take nothing for their journey, save a staff only, no scrip, no bread, no money in their purse, but be shod with sandals, and not put on 2 coats. And he said unto them, in whatsoever ye enter into a house, in what place soever ye enter into a house, there abide till you depart from that place. In Luke chapter 9, verse 3, it says, and he said unto them, take nothing for your journey, neither staves, nor scrip, neither bread, neither money, neither have 2 coats apiece. And whatsoever house ye enter there, and whatsoever house ye enter into, there abide, and thence depart. Carry neither purse, nor scrip, nor shoes, and salute no man by the ways. And into whatsoever house ye enter, first say, Peace be to this house, and in the same house remain, eating and drinking, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house, and into whatsoever city ye enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. And he said unto them, When I sent you without purse, and scrip, and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, Nothing. So see, we have here Hamashiach instructing his disciples at the time. This was before they were called the apostles. But he was instructing them to do the work, spread the gospel, spread the truth. And if you go into a city and start spreading the truth there to a person in a home, just eat what they give you, because truly they'll let you stay as long as they can so they can continue being edified with the true word. So he says, just eat what is given to you in the house that you're in. And not only that, but he said to them, when I sent you out like that, did you lack anything? And they said nothing. So that's the true work. And truly, the laborer, as is written, truly the laborer is worthy of his hire. It's a good work that you're doing. And any true person, follower of Hamashiach, with eyes to hear, eyes to see, ears to hear, they would welcome you and feed you as long as they can to get as much out of you, much truth out of you as possible. Now Paul says something different, and it seems like I said, it seems like he took pot shots at the apostles. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 5, verses 5 through 9, he says, For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness. Yah is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome, as the apostles of Christ, or as the apostles of Hamashiach. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of Yah. And in 2 Thessalonians, starting with chapter 3, verse 7, down to verse 12, he says, For yourselves know how ye ought to follow us. For we behaved not ourselves disorderly amongst you, neither did we eat any man's bread. For naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you, not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Yahushua Hamashiach, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. With quietness they work and eat their own bread? Paul, is that really what you think they should have done? The Messiah clearly told them not to take anything with them on their journey and to eat where they stayed, and that a workman was worthy of his meat or bread, working not at all. What made you think that they weren't putting in the work? So you see how it seems like Paul was taking pot shots at the real apostles, because he was calling these people on the low. He was saying that these people had a cloak of covetousness, right? Because they were eating other people's bread, because they were doing what Hamashiach told them and eating the food set before them in the house that they were edifying. Paul says that that's a cloak of covetousness. Paul claimed that, according to his command, right? He said, let me see. For we hear that there are some among you that walk disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such, we command and exhort. So he's rebuking the real apostles who are eating other people's bread and calling these people covetousness, saying, and deceitful at that, having a cloak of covetousness, right? So what we have here, when we look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul seems to take pot shots at the real apostles, saying things like, speaking of against eating without working. He said, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Hamashiach. So he was saying, we didn't seek your glory. We didn't seek any glory to show or to prove that we weren't burdensome as the apostles of Hamashiach. So he's claiming to be an apostle, and he's saying, I'm not as burdensome as those other apostles that don't work for their bread. He also said, let's see, for yourselves know how ye ought to follow us. Who's the us? Not the real apostles, because the real apostles didn't live by the creed of you don't work, you don't eat. So here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 7, he says, for yourselves know how ye ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you. To make it seem like the things, the way he operates is not disorderly. The way the other apostles operate is disorderly. That's what he's trying to insinuate here. The other apostles who didn't work for their food, right? He said, because he was saying in verse 8, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day. Then he says that we might not be chargeable to any of you, like as though the real apostles were chargeable. You see, the ones who didn't work for their food, who made that decision in Acts chapter 6 to not work, but to dedicate themselves continually to prayer and the ministering of the Ah's word, of Yahushua Mashiach's doctrine. Paul said, for when we were with you, this we commanded you. So this is not a commandment from Yahushua Mashiach. This isn't a commandment or a doctrine that the real apostles lived by, as we just stated. Paul is talking about him and whoever else is with him. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. And then he says, we hear that there are some who walk among you disorderly. Once again, calling those other apostles, the ones in Acts chapter 6, who decided to not work, but to minister the word, he's calling them disorderly. How do we know? He continues on and says, working not at all, but are busybodies. And then here he goes in verse 12. Now them that are such, we command and exhort. So now what we have here is Paul calling himself rebuking the real apostles who are not working, like we saw in Acts chapter 6. He's saying we command and exhort those real apostles. And once again, this we, so he's talking about him and whoever's with him. And it sounds like shots fired. It definitely sounds like Paul is taking shots at the real apostles.